April 1945. Eastern Germany. The bridge shouldn't have been standing at all. Tangemünde crossing, spanning the Elbe River, once an engineering marvel of the Third Reich, now a grotesque skeleton of twisted girders and shattered concrete. Wehrmacht engineers had demolished it themselves 3 weeks earlier, trying to slow the American advance. Now, in a cruel twist of fate, its mangled remains offered the only escape route for 50 kilometers in either direction. And escape was exactly what 100,000 desperate souls were attempting. Picture this: a German Wehrmacht colonel, Iron Cross still pinned to his tattered uniform, standing alongside an American sergeant from Iowa, both men directing traffic, both trying to prevent panic, both understanding that if this crossing collapses or if chaos erupts, thousands will die. This is not the war you know. This is the story of its strangest final act. Let me give you numbers that changed everything. German military intelligence, still functioning even as their nation disintegrated, had intercepted Soviet communications in late April 1945. What they discovered was a death sentence written in statistics. Of every 100 German soldiers captured by the Red Army, projections indicated fewer than 40 would ever see home again. The actual figures would prove even more horrific. But here's what mattered to the men crammed into trenches along the Eastern Front. Surrender to the Americans meant you'd probably live. Surrender to the Soviets meant you'd probably die. Not possibly, not maybe, probably. This wasn't propaganda. This was cold calculation backed by intelligence reports flooding through Wehrmacht command. Reports of Soviet-occupied territories in East Prussia, where an estimated 300,000 civilians had perished during the advance, killed in combat, executed in reprisals, or dead from exposure and starvation. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, in his final strategic assessment before Germany's collapse, wrote one directive that he underlined twice: maximum German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement completes. This wasn't defeatism. This was arithmetic, the equation of life versus death, measured by which uniform accepted your surrender. 20 Soviet divisions for every German division still combat effective. Think about that ratio. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces were advancing 30 kilometers daily. Refugee columns on foot managed 10 kilometers on good days. The math was brutal and simple. Behind 8 million German civilians fleeing westward came Soviet armor, Soviet artillery, Soviet infantry, with scores to settle after what Germany had done to their homeland. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared military machine on earth, was dissolving, not retreating in good order, not conducting a fighting withdrawal, dissolving. Soldiers were abandoning defensive positions their officers had ordered them to hold, destroying their own equipment when it slowed them down, fighting through SS blocking detachments who tried to stop them with threats of execution, all racing west toward one objective: the Elbe River and the American forces holding its western bank. Captain William Patterson of the 405th Infantry Regiment lowered his field glasses and watched the human flood approaching. His unit had reached the Elbe 2 weeks ago, positions established according to the Yalta agreements with the Soviets. What nobody had anticipated was that this destroyed river crossing would become ground zero for the largest voluntary military surrender in Western history. "Sir," his lieutenant asked, "what exactly are we supposed to do with all of them?" Patterson didn't have an answer. Nobody did. April 20th, 1945. General Walter Wenck's headquarters, east of the Elbe. Adolf Hitler's order was clear: attack toward Berlin with the 12th Army, break through Soviet lines, relieve the capital, die for the Reich, if necessary. Wenck made a different choice. He gathered his commanders, officers who'd fought across Poland, France, Russia, men who'd seen 6 years of total war.
"Comrades," he told them, "the war is lost. Our duty now is not to a dead ideology, but to the living, our soldiers, the civilians depending on us. We attack, but westward. We open a corridor to the American lines." This was mutiny, direct defiance of a Führer's order. In the insane final days of the Third Reich, SS courts-martial were still executing officers for less. But Wenck's intelligence officer, Colonel Gunther Reichhelm, had compiled statistics that made the decision clear. Soviet-occupied zones were seeing casualty rates among German civilians that, if applied to the populations now trapped between the Elbe and the advancing Red Army, meant potential deaths in the millions. So Wenck's 100,000 troops, including elite divisions still possessing operational armor, established a corridor, 40 kilometers of held territory, stretching from the Elbe back toward the scattered remnants of German forces trapped to the east. His soldiers would hold that passage against Soviet pressure while refugees streamed through. How many did he save? Estimates suggest 250,000 soldiers and civilians owe their lives to this general's defiance. Not everyone made it to Wenck's corridor. General Theodor Buss's Ninth Army, 200,000 soldiers, 40,000 civilians, was encircled southeast of Berlin. Hitler's orders: fight toward the capital. Wenck's message: break out west toward American lines. The breakout from Halbach began at 8 p.m. on April 25th. Leading elements punched through Soviet lines using the last fuel reserves. Behind them came the column. 30 kilometers of humanity stumbling through swamp and forest. Combat troops, medical units, civilian refugees, even regimental bands carrying their instruments, though God knows what they thought they'd need them for. Soviet forces reacted with overwhelming firepower. Katyusha rocket batteries turned the forest paths into killing zones. IL-2 Sturmikov aircraft strafed anything that moved. T-34 tanks crushed defensive positions and the people manning them. Bodies piled up at stream crossings, where Soviet machine guns had perfect fields of fire. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding remnants of a panzer regiment, later described it: "No longer war, but massacre. We kept moving because stopping meant certain death. I saw officers shoot their own wounded rather than leave them for Soviet capture." Of 200,000 who began the breakout, approximately 40,000 reached Wenck's lines and eventual American custody. The Halbe Forest Cemetery today contains 24,000 graves, most marked unknown German soldier. 60,000 were captured by Soviet forces. Few survived the camps. The rest simply vanished into the forest's depths, joining the countless unnamed dead of history's bloodiest war.
General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, faced an impossible situation. The Yalta agreements were explicit. German forces must surrender to all allies simultaneously. No separate surrenders to Western forces while still fighting the Soviets. That violated inter-allied agreements that President Roosevelt had personally negotiated. But the humanitarian catastrophe was undeniable. Starting April 24th, forward American observation posts reported extraordinary scenes. German vehicles approaching with headlights blazing, a violation of basic combat doctrine. Wehrmacht units arriving in parade formation, officers maintaining military bearing even in defeat. These weren't beaten rabbles. These were organized forces choosing captivity over continued resistance. 3,000 voluntary surrenders on April 24th, 7,000 on the 25th, 15,000 on the 26th, and the numbers kept climbing. Major James Morrison, operations officer for the 102nd Infantry Division, ran calculations that were sobering. Processing 1,000 prisoners required 3 tons of food daily, 5,000 gallons of water, medical screening, delousing stations, documentation, 12 forms per individual, according to Geneva Convention requirements. At peak flow, 20,000 were arriving daily. The system couldn't handle it. The paperwork alone would have taken years. Colonel Benjamin Thompson made the crucial decision. Forget the documentation. Get them fed. Get them deloused. Get the wounded medical attention. Paperwork can wait. Lives can't. You might wonder, why were Germans so desperate to surrender specifically to Americans? The answer spread through Wehrmacht communication channels with extraordinary speed. Radio intercepts by U.S. signals intelligence revealed telling conversations between German units. April 27th, transmission from 3rd Panzer Corps. Americans honoring Geneva Convention at all collection points. Medical treatment provided, food distribution confirmed. That last point was crucial. German forces had been on starvation rations for weeks. The psychological impact of American abundance was immediate and profound. The Ruhr Pocket surrender earlier in April had established the precedent. When 325,000 German troops gave themselves up to American forces, they received food, medical care, and protection from revenge-seeking displaced persons. Treatment that, after 6 years of total war, seemed almost miraculous. Sergeant Willem Beck of the 21st Panzer Division later testified, "We had heard the Americans fed prisoners, provided medical care, didn't shoot the wounded. After years of total war, such humanity seemed impossible. Yet we raced toward it." But reaching American lines meant surviving a gauntlet. SS blocking detachments had orders to execute any soldier retreating without authorization. Military police checkpoints on every western road, turning back or shooting defeatists attempting to flee. The SS remained fanatically loyal even as the Reich collapsed, viewing surrender as betrayal rather than survival. Back to Tangemünde, May 4th through 9th, 1945. The damaged bridge became the focal point of everything. German military engineers and American combat engineers worked from opposite banks to shore up the wreckage, creating a precarious single-file pathway across the river. 100,000 people crossed that broken structure in 4 days. Think about that. 100,000. Wehrmacht colonels directed traffic alongside American sergeants. German military police maintained order on the eastern approach. American MPs controlled the western bank. Both sides understood. If this crossing became blocked, if panic set in, thousands would be trapped as Soviet forces closed in from the east. Lieutenant Colonel William Davis of the 102nd Infantry Division described the surreal cooperation. German officers saluted us. We saluted back. Their engineers asked ours for equipment to strengthen the bridge. We gave it to them. Everyone understood. Lives depended on keeping that crossing open. The human stream was endless, heartbreaking. A Wehrmacht colonel arrived with his complete regimental staff, insisting on formally surrendering his unit's battle flag, maintaining military honor even in defeat. An SS general appeared in full-dress uniform, requesting honorable captivity for his men. A Kriegsmarine captain led 200 sailors who hadn't seen the ocean in months, pressed into desperate ground combat. Female auxiliary personnel, some as young as 17, begged American soldiers not to send them back east. Most knew exactly what Soviet occupation meant for German women. The civilians were most poignant. Families pushed belongings in baby carriages. Children separated from parents were passed hand to hand across the bridge by strangers. Elderly people too weak to walk were carried by medical staff, who refused to abandon them. Master Sergeant James Patterson, supervising the western approach, later wrote, "They came in waves, dawn to dusk, then through the night by moonlight. Soldiers stacking weapons like cordwood, women with babies, kids who looked like they should be in grammar school wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. Nobody ran, nobody fought. They were just grateful to reach our side."
Captain David Miller, medical officer with the 330th Medical Battalion, performed surgery for 72 straight hours. He later recalled, "These weren't fresh combat wounds, these were weeks old, infected, untreated. Men walking on broken bones, fighting with shrapnel still embedded in their bodies. Female auxiliaries with untreated injuries from assault. Children with malnutrition so severe they couldn't stand." Medical units estimated 30% of surrendering Germans required immediate attention. Malnutrition was universal. Typhus, spread by lice, threatened epidemic proportions. Combat wounds left untreated for weeks had turned gangrenous. Battlefield surgery units designed to treat dozens were handling hundreds daily. The supply situation strained even American abundance. A single infantry division carried rations for 15,000 men for 7 days. By May 5th, they were feeding 60,000 prisoners, plus uncounted civilians. Emergency convoys ran continuously from rear depots. C-47 transport aircraft dropped supplies by parachute. The Red Ball Express, legendary supply operation that had fueled Patton's race across France, was reactivated to feed surrendered enemies. May 7th, 2:41 a.m. General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. Ceasefire would take effect on 11:01 p.m. on May 8th. This gave German forces exactly 45 hours to reach American lines. What followed defied military categorization. This wasn't retreat or organized surrender. This was human migration under arms. Intelligence estimated 250,000 German military personnel remained east of the Elbe on May 7th. Within 45 hours, approximately 180,000 would successfully reach American lines. The others would enter Soviet captivity with terrible consequences. General Wank's final operation exemplified military honor in defeat. His 12th Army held the corridor until the last possible moment. At 6 p.m. on May 7th, Wank issued his final order. "The 12th Army has fulfilled its last duty. We have saved all we could save. Every commander is now free to seek safety for his men." Not a surrender, a release from duty, allowing his soldiers to make their own choices. Wank himself crossed at 2 a.m. on May 8th, walking across a damaged railroad bridge near Tangemünde, 21 hours before the ceasefire. Behind him, Soviet tanks were already entering positions his men had abandoned. Of his original 200,000 troops, approximately 100,000 reached American lines. An estimated 250,000 civilians were saved by his defiance of Hitler's orders.
The statistics tell one story. Individual voices reveal another. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann flew his Messerschmitt Bf 109 west until fuel ran out, crash landing in an American-occupied field rather than risk Soviet territory. U-boat commander Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock sailed his submarine up the Elbe as far as navigable, scuttled it, then led his crew overland to American lines. A Wehrmacht doctor stayed with severely wounded patients who couldn't be moved, knowing it meant Soviet captivity, saying only, "Someone must care for those who cannot flee." A teenage soldier gave his place on an overcrowded truck to an elderly civilian, then began walking the 100 kilometers to American lines. He arrived 18 hours after the ceasefire, technically too late. Sympathetic American guards accepted him anyway. Corporal Friedrich Müller kept a diary throughout captivity. His first entry after surrender: "First day without fear in 6 years. Americans gave us bread. Real bread, not sawdust. A guard offered me a cigarette. I cried. After what we did, why do they treat us as humans?" Nurse Hildegard Schneider crossed with a military hospital unit. "We had 300 wounded. Americans took them all, even SS men." American doctors operated through the night saving German soldiers. One told me, "The war's over. Now we're just doctors and you're just patients." I couldn't believe such mercy existed. Wehrmacht Private Hans Bauer, age 17. I'd been told Americans would torture prisoners, that surrender meant dishonor. Instead, they gave me chocolate. I hadn't seen chocolate in 3 years. A medic treated my infected wound. An officer asked if I could contact my mother. They treated me not as an enemy, but as a boy who'd been forced to fight. The Rhine-Wiesen lager camps, temporary enclosures along the Rhine, became collection points for this human flood. Often just agricultural fields surrounded by barbed wire. They held over 1 million German prisoners by May 15, 1945. Conditions were harsh. Prisoners initially had no shelter except holes dug in the ground. Food was basic, 1,200 calories daily initially, increased as supplies improved. Water came from rivers and temporary pipes. Sanitation was primitive. Disease spread in overcrowded conditions, yet the death rate remained below 1%. Compare that to Soviet camps where death rates exceeded 35%. Colonel James Foster, commanding Camp Remagen, faced extraordinary challenges. Designed for 100,000, we held 184,000 by May 12. SS generals next to communist prisoners, Hitler Youth teenagers beside Stalingrad veterans, female auxiliaries requiring separate facilities, naval personnel who'd never seen ground combat. It was controlled chaos, but we maintained order and kept them alive. That last phrase, "kept them alive," was the crucial difference. NKVD documents declassified after 1991 confirmed German fears were completely justified. Of approximately 3 million German prisoners taken by Soviet forces, at least 1.1 million died in captivity. Death rates in 1945 to 46 exceeded 50% in many camps. The causes were multiple. Soviet logistics could barely supply their own forces, let alone millions of prisoners. German POWs received 600 to 800 calories daily, far below survival requirements for forced labor. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis spread unchecked. Siberian winter temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius without adequate clothing or shelter. Beyond material deprivation was systematic brutality. Soviet guards, many having lost families to German atrocities, showed little mercy. Prisoners worked in uranium mines without protection, in logging camps with impossible quotas, on construction projects where safety was ignored. The wounded and sick were often shot as useless mouths. Former Soviet officer Viktor Astafiev later wrote, "We were told every dead German was payment for our suffering, payment for Leningrad, Stalingrad, for 27 million Soviet dead. Guards competed to see who could work prisoners to death fastest. To show mercy was to betray our fallen comrades." The statistics told the complete story. American records, 3.8 million German prisoners, approximately 137,000 deaths, a 3.6% death rate. Soviet records, even official figures, acknowledged 356,700 deaths, but German research indicates the true number exceeded 1 million. The differential was starker for specific groups. Waffen-SS members, 20% survival rate in Soviet camps versus 95% in American custody. Female auxiliaries, systematic assault in Soviet custody, Americans generally release them within months. Hitler Youth teenagers, often executed immediately by the Soviets as fascist fanatics. Americans processed them as juvenile prisoners requiring rehabilitation. The last German soldier to cross at Tangemünde was Volkssturm member Heinrich Fischer, age 63. He reached American lines at 10:47 p.m. on May 8, 1945.
exactly 14 minutes before the ceasefire took effect. When asked why he'd risked everything to cross, Fisher, a grandfather who'd been pressed into service defending his town, simply said, "I wanted to see my grandchildren again." He did. Millions who failed to reach American lines did not. Private First Class Joseph Martinez, who helped process surrendering Germans, provided perhaps the most profound observation. They weren't really surrendering to us. They were fleeing from something worse. We just happened to represent survival. Any one of us might have done the same in their position. For historians, the event raises questions still debated today. Was American acceptance of these surrenders a humanitarian triumph or violation of inter-allied agreements? Did saving German soldiers from Soviet captivity serve justice or subvert it? The human impact, however, was undeniable. German-American relations in the post-war period were profoundly influenced by this mercy. West Germany's integration into NATO, its development as a democratic state, its role as America's key European ally during the Cold War, all influenced by the memory of American humanity in victory. General Walter Wenck survived the war, living until 1982. In a 1975 interview, he reflected, "I disobeyed Hitler's orders and would do so again. My duty wasn't to a dead ideology, but to living men under my command. Every soldier we got across the Elbe was a victory. Every civilian saved was a triumph. We lost the war, but in those last days we saved what could be saved: human lives." Many survivors and their descendants still gather annually on May 8th to honor Wenck's memory, calling him the general who chose life over death, mercy over ideology.
By 11:01 p.m., May 8, 1945, when the ceasefire took effect, American forces had processed approximately 1.5 million German military prisoners in the war's final 3 weeks. The 102nd Infantry Division alone accepted surrender of 313,000 enemies, more than the entire German army that invaded Poland in 1939. Analysis showed fewer than 20,000 were taken in actual combat. The rest surrendered voluntarily, often fighting through their own lines to do so. General Omar Bradley later wrote, "We prepared for victory, not for this. The German army didn't just surrender, it dissolved. Men who'd fought fanatically for 6 years suddenly cared only about reaching our lines. They knew what we learned later. Surrender to us meant life. Capture by Soviets meant probable death." Why this matters? The mass German surrender to American forces in April-May 1945 represented more than military capitulation. It was a massive humanitarian crisis, an ideological collapse, and ultimately a testament to mercy's power in warfare's darkest hour. It demonstrated that even in humanity's most devastating conflict, the difference between mercy and revenge, between life and death, could be measured in the simple question of which uniform received your surrender. Military historian John Keegan later wrote, "The German flight to American lines in 1945 was unprecedented. Never before had such numbers deliberately sought specific captivity while still capable of resistance. It demonstrated that even in total war, human calculations of mercy versus revenge could override ideology and orders." The damaged crossing at Tangemünde was never rebuilt, but its memory endures as a monument to one of warfare's fundamental truths. In the end, the measure of victory is not in enemies destroyed, but in lives saved, not in vengeance taken, but in mercy shown. That is the final lesson of the German flight to American lines in 1945.
that even in history's most devastating conflict, humanity could prevail over hatred, mercy could triumph over revenge, and life could be chosen over death. For the hundreds of thousands who crossed the Elbe in those desperate days, that choice made all the difference. Their crossing was not just escape from Soviet retribution. It was passage from the old world of total war and racial hatred to the possibility of a new world built on law, mercy, and human dignity. That so many risked everything to reach American lines was not just a military phenomenon, but a profound human testament to the power of mercy in victory. The story ends where it began, at a damaged bridge over the Elbe, where desperate enemies became grateful prisoners, where American soldiers became unlikely saviors, and where the simple act of accepting surrender became an affirmation of humanity's capacity for mercy, even in its darkest hour. That is the lasting legacy of those desperate days in 1945, proof that even in total war's aftermath, the choice between mercy and revenge, between humanity and vengeance, could determine not just individual fates, but the future of nations and the judgment of history itself.